I stood frozen at the school pickup, the weight of the words still hanging in the air. She's just the babysitter. My daughter-in-law's voice rang out, but it was the principal's knowing look that spoke volume. The laughter of the other parents blurred around me, but all I could hear was the cruel dismissal of a lifetime of sacrifice. Just the babysitter? The tuition checks I paid said otherwise. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The school parking lot was a quiet battlefield in the late afternoon sun. The manicured lawns of the private academy stretched out, a picture-perfect facade of privilege and order. Caroline Myers, 70, a quiet presence in her crisp blazer and sensible shoes, eased her car into a spot at the edge of the lot. The tires of her aging sedan crunched against the gravel as she parked, careful not to hit the yellow curb. A habit of precision, one born from decades of managing numbers down to the last cent. She took a moment before exiting the car, glancing toward the school entrance. The large, ivy-clad building loomed ahead, a fortress of academia, and beyond it, the playground where children's laughter echoed like a distant memory. Her heart swelled with pride as she thought of Lily, her granddaughter, safe inside, learning, growing. Lily, her sweet, quiet Lily. Caroline stepped out of the car and made her way toward the entrance, adjusting her glasses, her breath steady despite the ache in her chest. She had been waiting for this moment all day, the chance to see her granddaughter's face, hear about her day, to make the mundane feel significant in a world where every dollar counted, every semester, every tuition check. Those were sacrifices made for Lily's future. It was a love that no one could take from her. As Caroline approached the school's main entrance, she spotted her daughter-in-law, Tina, standing with a group of other parents. Tina was tall and sharply dressed, her posture rigid as if the very fabric of her clothing could compensate for her insecurities. Caroline could feel her eyes narrow at the sight of her, but she pushed it down. She was here for Lily. Lily emerged from the glass doors, her small frame framed in the sunlight, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She smiled brightly at her grandmother, her eyes lighting up the moment she saw Caroline. But just as Caroline's heart began to lift, Tina's voice sliced through the air like a razor. "She's just the babysitter," Tina said loudly, her tone casual, almost offhand, as if she had no idea how sharp the words would land. The words hung in the air, ricocheting off the walls of the school. Caroline froze, her chest tight with an ache that came from a place deeper than any wound. Around her, the other parents, well-groomed, polished, stopped in their tracks, some turning slightly to listen, others pretending they hadn't heard. But it was too late. The damage was done. Caroline's face burned. It was as though the world had shifted, and she was standing on the wrong side of the glass. She forced herself to breathe, to keep her feet grounded. She didn't look at Tina. Not yet. Her eyes, though, found Lily's. Lily's small hand clenched around the strap of her backpack. Her eyes, dark with anger and hurt, flicked from her mother to Caroline. For a moment, Caroline saw a flash of the girl she used to be. Quiet, observant, fiercely loyal. Her hand moved instinctively, reaching for her grandmother's. Caroline took it, squeezing gently, but there was a sadness in the gesture, an unspoken apology. Caroline bent down slightly, keeping her voice low, steady. "Dignity first, sweetheart," she whispered. Lily didn't respond. She just squeezed her grandmother's hand tighter, and for a moment, the world seemed to fall silent around them. Tina, oblivious to the gravity of the moment, turned away, talking animatedly to one of the other mothers, her voice bright and sharp, as if the whole thing were no more than a minor inconvenience. Principal Rowe, however, had not missed a beat. She stood nearby, arms crossed, her sharp eyes watching the scene unfold. When Caroline's gaze met hers, the principal gave a brief, knowing nod. It was subtle, a small acknowledgement of the humiliation Caroline had just endured. But it was there. Caroline didn't feel the need for more. She could hold her own, even now, even here. With Lily still gripping her hand, Caroline turned and walked away, her posture stiff, but her steps sure. She didn't speak to Tina. She didn't need to. The truth had been written in the silence, in the quiet defiance of her granddaughter's grip. They walked to the car together, as if nothing had happened, as if the weight of the world hadn't just tried to crush them, Inside the car, Caroline sat silently for a moment, the engine idling. Lily didn't speak either, her gaze fixed on the window. Caroline's fingers, however, were already moving, reaching for the folder on the passenger seat. She flipped it open, revealing the neatly organized receipts, every semester, every tuition payment, each check, each wire transfer was there, meticulously documented. The numbers didn't lie. With a slow exhale, Caroline pulled out one of the receipts, studying it for a long moment. She could feel her pulse quicken. There was something about today, about Tina's words, that felt like the beginning of something far more dangerous than she was ready for. And as she placed the receipt back in the folder, a cold determination set in. This wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. The car hummed softly in the quiet of the driveway, the only sound the steady rhythm of the engine idling. Caroline's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the binder on the passenger. The familiar weight of it was both reassuring and heavy with meaning, each page inside a silent witness to the years of sacrifice, of work, and, most of all, love. She flipped open the binder with a practiced motion, her eyes immediately drawn to the rows of receipts that filled it. Semester after semester, she had paid for Lily's tuition, the wire transfers, the checks, the confirmation email, everything meticulously organized in clear plastic sleeves, each document proof of her unwavering commitment. It was an obsession almost, this need to document, to keep track of every cent. But in the face of what had just happened, it felt like the only armor she had. Caroline took one of the receipts in her hands, her fingers brushing over the ink. The numbers were so familiar. She'd written every check. She'd wired every payment. The private academy may have been a place of privilege for some, but for her, it was a place of pride, a symbol of everything she had worked for in her life. And it was all for Lily, always for Lily. She took a deep breath and began copying the checks, the wire confirmation, and the tuition receipt. Her movements were precise, methodical, as if the very act of preserving these records could protect her against the insult she had just endured. There was something grounding about the task, the steady rhythm of writing out the numbers, the clicking sound of the copy machine in the next room. But even as her fingers worked, her mind kept drifting back to Tina's words. She's just the babysitter. The sting of it lingered in her chest, like a slow, gnawing ache. But Caroline pushed it down, focusing instead on the binder in front of her. Let Tina have her moment. Let her shout her lies from the rooftops. Caroline had the truth, and the truth was inked in black and white. There was a sharp knock at the door, and Caroline's head snapped up. It was Gloria, her lifelong friend. Caroline had known her longer than anyone, had seen her through her own battles, had shared her joys and sorrows. Gloria was a woman of fire, her loyalty unwavering, and her fury was something to behold. "Are you kidding me?" Gloria's voice cracked through the air like a whip. She stormed into the house without waiting for an invitation. "That woman is out of her mind. Who does she think she is?" Caroline didn't need to look up. She could hear the sharp click of Gloria's heels on the hardwood floor, the rustle of her coat as she shut it. "I don't know, Gloria," Caroline murmured, her voice calm, a stark contrast to the storm swirling in Gloria's chest. "But she's made her position clear." Gloria huffed, her words clipped with frustration. "Well, I'm about to make hers clear. You are not just the babysitter, Caroline. Not by a long shot." Caroline shook her head, pressing the copy button on the machine again. Let her brag. The truth is inked, but Gloria wasn't having it. She stood beside Caroline, arms crossed, her eyes narrowing. "She's making a fool of you, and I won't stand for it. You've done everything for that girl. Everything. And she—" Gloria's voice faltered for a second, the emotions spilling over. "She's going to take everything from you?" "Not if I have anything to say about it." Caroline finally looked up at her friend, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I don't need her approval, Gloria. I have something far more valuable." She held up the binder, the one that contained all the proof, the record, the evidence. "This, and it's enough." Gloria's expression softened slightly, though the fire was still there in her eyes. "Well, it's a start anyway. But we both know she's not done. She's gonna push harder. This won't be over until you put her in her place." Caroline nodded slowly, her fingers pressing down on the binder as though it could anchor her. "I'm ready." Just then, a soft voice interrupted the quiet between them. Caroline looked up to see Lily standing in the doorway, her small face shadowed with concern. She was holding something in her hand, clutching it like a lifeline. "Grandma," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. "Are you okay?" Caroline's heart clenched at the sight of her granddaughter. She wanted to tell Lily everything was fine, that it would all be okay. But the truth was, it wasn't. And yet, there was something in Lily's eyes, a quiet strength, that reminded Caroline of why she kept fighting. Lily stepped into the room, walking to her grandmother's side. She placed her arms around Caroline's shoulders, pulling her into a tight hug. "I love you, Grandma," Lily whispered, her voice soft but steady. "I know you're doing the right thing." Caroline's breath hitched. The truth, it seemed, had already reached Lily. And for the first time that day, Caroline allowed herself to feel something other than the weight of the world pressing down on her. She squeezed Lily back, her hands shaking slightly. "I love you too, sweetheart." A phone rang, breaking the moment. Caroline glanced at the caller ID. It was Principal Rowe. "Hello?" Caroline answered, her voice steady but guarded. "You should come by my office tomorrow." Principal Rowe's voice came through, crisp and quiet, but there was something in it, a hint of urgency. "We need to talk." Caroline's chest tightened, but she didn't let the worry show. "I'll be there." She hung up the phone, the room feeling a little smaller, the air a little thinner. Gloria raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. Well, looks like you've got a friend in high places." Caroline didn't respond. She was already thinking ahead. This was just the beginning, and tomorrow, she would take another step forward. But for now, she looked at her granddaughter, her heart swelling with love and resolve. The game had only just begun. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the kitchen table. Caroline sat at one end, the unopened letter from the bursar's office resting in front of her like a challenge. She had been waiting for this, waiting for confirmation of what she already knew. But now that it was here, with its stiff envelope and official seal, it felt like the weight of the entire situation was pressing down on her all over again. She exhaled slowly, her fingers resting on the edge of the paper. The edges of the envelope were sharp, almost threatening, as if it knew what she would find inside. But she wasn't afraid. She had nothing to hide. The soft rustling of paper filled the silence as she slit the envelope open. She unfolded the letter carefully, as if the words inside were fragile, delicate, yet strong enough to change everything. Her eyes scanned the typed words, quickly locking onto the key sentence. "Paid in full for the 2024 to 2025 academic year under the name Caroline Myers." A steady, satisfied breath left her lips. The proof was in black and white. No longer could anyone question her involvement, her commitment, her place in Lily's life. The tuition was paid by her. Every cent, every semester, every year. Tina's dismissal of her as merely the babysitter was nothing but a lie. And this letter, this simple piece of paper, was the undeniable truth. Her hands were steady as she folded the letter and slipped it into a clear plastic sleeve. As she turned to reach for her binder, she heard the creak of the front door. Gloria, of course. She could always tell when her friend was about to make her entrance. Loud, commanding, yet always with the warmth of familiarity. "Caroline, you will not believe the rumors swirling around that school." Gloria's voice rang out as she breezed into the kitchen. "That woman," Gloria's lip curled with disdain, "has no shame." Caroline didn't respond immediately, her focus still on the letter in her hands. She slid it carefully into her binder, placing it beside the copies of the tuition receipts she had already filed. There was something almost ritualistic about the way she handled the papers. It wasn't just about proof. It was about ownership. This was hers. This was Lily's future. Gloria stood over her shoulder, watching the meticulous arrangement. "You can't just hold on to that letter, Caroline. You have to use it. You know that, right?" "I know," Caroline said softly, her voice distant, almost lost in thought. She paused, her hand hovering over the binder for a moment longer. "I'm just waiting for the right moment." Gloria huffed impatiently, her arms crossing. "The right moment? Caroline, the moment is now. You've let her walk all over you for too long. It's time to show Tina that she can't manipulate the truth. Not on your watch." Caroline turned slowly, meeting her friend's eyes with a quiet but unshakable resolve. "I'm not afraid of her, Gloria, but I'm going to do this my way." Gloria opened her mouth to argue but was interrupted by the soft patter of footsteps in the hallway. A moment later, Lily appeared in the doorway. She was clutching her backpack straps, looking smaller than usual, her eyes wide with uncertainty. Caroline's heart clenched as she took in the worried look on her granddaughter's face. "I overheard Mom talking," Lily said in a small voice, barely above a whisper. She said, you're not really paying for my school. That it's all just a lie." Caroline's heart stuttered. The words cut deeper than she expected. Tina's accusations were spreading even here, even into the sanctuary of their home. Gloria stepped forward, ready to speak, but Caroline gently held up a hand, signaling for her to stay back. She crouched down, bringing herself to Lily's eye level, the letter still in her hand. She smiled softly, though the sadness in her eyes was impossible to hide. "Sweetheart," Caroline said, her voice gentle but firm, "your mom is wrong. I've been paying for your school for a long time now, all the tuition, every semester. Those checks, the wires, they came from me. All of it." Lily blinked, her brow furrowing as if she were trying to make sense of the confusion. But Mom said—" "I know what she said," Caroline interrupted, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of quiet strength. "But the truth? The truth is what matters. And the truth is in here." She held up the binder, her fingers grazing the top edge. Lily took a step forward, her eyes scanning the binder with a mixture of awe and confusion. "Can I see it?" Carolyn opened the binder slowly, flipping to the page with the bursar's letter. She handed it to Lily, watching as her granddaughter's small hands closed around the paper. Lily's eyes scanned the words, her brow furrowing as she read. After a long silence, Lily finally looked up, her eyes wide with understanding. "Mom's lying?" she whispered, as though saying it aloud made the truth more real. Caroline's throat tightened, but she nodded. "She is, sweetheart. But it's not your fault. You don't need to worry about that. You just need to know this, that no matter what, I'm here for you. And I always will be." Lily's eyes filled with unshed tears, and she rushed into Caroline's arms, the letter still clutched in her small hands. "I love you, Grandma," she whispered, her voice trembling. Caroline's heart ached with the tenderness of the moment, but there was also something else, something colder. Tina's lies weren't just words. They were attempts to tear apart everything Caroline had built. And now, with this letter, with the truth in her hands, Caroline could feel the first stirrings of a battle she wasn't going to lose. As she held Lily close, the doorbell rang, snapping her out of the moment. She looked over at Gloria, who raised an eyebrow. Who could that be? Caroline stood, her expression hardening. "I don't know, but I think I'm about to find out." The game was about to shift. The ballroom was gilded with soft light, the chandeliers above casting a warm, golden glow on the crowd below. Caroline stood by the entrance, taking in the scene with quiet observation. The annual fundraiser for Lily's school was in full swing, high-end dresses and polished shoes gliding over the marble floors, laughter and idle chatter mixing with the soft clink of glasses. It was all very proper, very refined. And for the first time in years, Caroline felt like she was on the outside of it all, like a guest at a party that didn't quite fit her invitation. Her navy dress, a simple but elegant thing she'd worn at family gatherings, suddenly felt too plain amidst the designer gowns and tailor-made suits. But Caroline didn't mind. She didn't need to stand out here. She just needed to observe. The air was thick with polite conversation, the occasional burst of laughter cutting through the hum. Caroline held her glass of water, her gaze shifting slowly from person to person. Parents of her granddaughter's classmates, all mingling, some in genuine conversation, others engaging in a subtle game of status. She scanned the crowd and found Tina, standing near the center of the room, talking animatedly to a group of parents. Caroline's eyes narrowed as she watched Tina's gestures grow more animated, her voice growing louder, competing for attention. Tina was all too eager to bask in the spotlight, a smile that seemed just a little too wide for comfort. "Yes," Tina was saying, her voice echoing just slightly above the murmurs around her. "I'm the one who's been handling all the school fees for Lily, you know. It's been a huge commitment, but it's worth it, of course. I wouldn't have it any other way." The words hung in the air for a moment, her self-congratulation clear for all to hear. Caroline's grip tightened on her water glass, the chill of the liquid doing nothing to cool the growing heat in her chest. She felt a prickle of heat at the back of her neck as the other parents nodded, some of them exchanging knowing glances, others smiling in quiet appreciation, possibly unaware of the implications beneath Tina's boasting. But Caroline wasn't fooled. She knew what Tina was doing. She was rewriting the story, turning herself into the savior, the martyr who had sacrificed so much, when in truth, it had always been Caroline who had paid. Caroline remained still, her face unreadable, though a small, faint smile touched her lips. She was a spectator in this dance of appearances, but she didn't need to dance to win. She would let the truth be the final step. She caught the eye of Principal Rowe from across the room. The older woman stood in a small group, her arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. Her gaze flicked over to Caroline, then back to Tina. There was a subtle nod, the kind that spoke volumes, but only if you were paying attention. Caroline's smile remained faint, acknowledging the quiet support from the principal without making a scene. Gloria, ever observant, had joined Caroline at her side, leaning in slightly as she surveyed the room with her sharp eyes. "Let the rope tighten," Gloria whispered under her breath, her voice laced with a quiet, knowing amusement. "She's digging herself a hole." Caroline didn't respond immediately, but the tension in her shoulders eased slightly at the words. Gloria had a way of seeing things clearly, cutting through the fog of family politics with a razor-sharp edge. Caroline had always appreciated that about her. "You know, I think it's about time we had a little conversation with some of these people," Gloria continued. "They don't know the whole story, Caroline. And maybe it's time they did." Caroline's gaze moved once more to Tina, whose loud boasting continued, now directed at another group of parents who had gathered near the hors d'oeuvres table. She could almost hear Tina's voice cutting through the polite murmur, her confidence swelling with each word. She felt the weight of the evening pressing down on her, but she didn't let it show. Her thoughts shifted to Eric. She scanned the room, finally spotting him at the edge, nursing a drink, and looking every bit the reluctant participant. His eyes avoided hers, his posture stiff and uncomfortable, as if the room's air had grown thick with tension. He wasn't engaging with anyone, just standing there, silent, watching his wife dominate the conversation with the other parents. He wasn't here for her. He wasn't here for Lily either. He was here to avoid the fight. But Caroline wasn't about to let him off that easy. A brief flicker of guilt brushed against her thoughts, but she buried it. She wasn't doing this for Eric. She was doing this for Lily, for herself. Her fingers lightly grazed the edge of her binder, tucked under her arm, the weight of it a steady reminder of her resolve. The truth was on her side. It had always been there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for its moment to rise. As Tina continued her performance, Caroline took a deep breath. The truth, wrapped in documents and receipts, was about to take center stage. And when it did, Tina's carefully constructed facade would crumble. A sudden laugh broke through the crowd, pulling Caroline's attention back to the scene in front of her. Tina had just made a joke, and the group of parents around her had laughed, some a little too enthusiastically. Caroline's lip curled slightly, her fingers curling tighter around her binder. She was done letting Tina steal the show. The evening's air shifted just slightly, and Caroline knew the moment of reckoning was drawing near. But for now, she remained in the background, an observer in this high-stakes game of appearances. The first move had been made. The next would be hers. The courtroom was sterile, bright white walls, the smell of fresh polish on wooden benches, and the hum of whispered conversations filling the air. Caroline sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The hard, cold wood beneath her felt like an anchor, keeping her rooted in the reality of the situation, a reality she had never imagined facing. Rachel Denton, her attorney, sat beside her, reviewing documents with a calm, methodical precision. Rachel's presence was steady, like a rock in the storm, but even she couldn't entirely shield Caroline from the undercurrent of anxiety that thrummed through her. The courtroom door opened, and Tina stepped inside with all the grace of someone who felt they were about to win. She wore a suit that made her look like a corporate executive, her hair pulled tight, a smile painted across her face, as if she were the one about to be crowned victor in a game where Caroline had already lost. But Caroline hadn't lost. Not yet. Tina's lawyer, a tall man with slicked back hair, walked beside her, his demeanor calm, confident, a stark contrast to Caroline's own sense of looming dread. The judge, Samuel Ortiz, sat at the front of the room, his stern eyes scanning the papers in front of him with a disinterest that seemed to seep into the room. The gavel struck once, loud and commanding, signaling the start of the hearing. "Let's begin," Judge Ortiz said, his voice like gravel scraping across stone. His eyes flicked to Tina, then to Caroline and Rachel, as if mentally assessing the weight of what was about to unfold. Tina stood first, her voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. "Your Honor, I am here today to petition for guardianship of my daughter, Lily. Caroline Myers, despite her financial support, is nothing more than a babysitter, a convenience for the real parent. I'm the one who provides for her. I'm the one who makes the decision, and I'm the one who deserves to be in control of Lily's life." Her words were rehearsed, every syllable dripping with the self-righteousness of someone who truly believed they were in the right. Caroline's chest tightened at Tina's casual dismissal of everything she had done for her granddaughter, but she stayed silent, watching intently, her fingers still gripping her lap. Tina's lawyer nodded in agreement, adding, "We ask the court to recognize the primacy of Tina Myers' role in Lily's life and grant her the authority to act as the sole guardian." Rachel shifted beside Caroline, her presence like a steadying force. She wasn't shaken by Tina's grandstanding, not even a little. She'd been preparing for this moment. Rachel stood and moved to the front of the courtroom, her steps purposeful, her demeanor cool. The room seemed to breathe with a collective anticipation as she addressed the judge. "Your Honor, I would like to submit evidence that contradicts the petitioner's claims. First, I have here notarized copies of the tuition payments for Lily's education, every check, every wire transfer, and every semester that has been paid by Caroline Myers." Rachel handed the stack of documents to the court clerk, who passed them to the judge. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Ortiz flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable. Caroline's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't flinch. The truth was in those papers. She knew what was coming. One by one, the courtroom gasped as the receipts, clear and undeniable, were displayed in front of them. It wasn't just the amounts, it was the dates, the consistency, the years of financial commitment. Every page was a punch to the narrative Tina had tried to build, a story of control, of false ownership. Judge Ortiz glanced up from the papers, his eyes narrowing as he fixed Tina with a look of unamused scrutiny. "Miss Myers," the judge said, his voice clipped, "you're suggesting that Ms. Caroline Myers is merely a babysitter?" His eyes flicked back to the papers in his hands. "Yet here I see years of tuition payments, records of significant financial contribution. Babysitters don't pay tuition, Ms. Myers. Grandmothers do." The words struck like thunder in the room. Caroline held her breath, feeling the surge of vindication ripple through her, but she didn't let herself react. Not yet. She had done her part. Now it was time for Tina to face the consequences. Tina's face paled, the color draining from her cheeks as the weight of the truth hit her. The room had shifted, the balance of power subtly tilting. Tina's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, her carefully constructed facade of motherhood crumbling in real time. Caroline's fingers twitched, but she kept her hands still. Rachel, calm and collected, glanced over at her, offering a brief, knowing smile. Tina's lawyer, clearly realizing the damage, shifted uneasily, but Tina wasn't done. She opened her mouth to argue, her voice shaking with frustration, but before she could, Rachel stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a hot knife. "Your Honor," Rachel said, turning to the judge with a quiet but cutting tone, "I ask that you dismiss this petition. The facts are clear, and the record is unassailable. Tina's claims are not just inaccurate, they're an attempt to rewrite reality." The courtroom was still, the silence punctuated only by the shuffle of papers as the judge glanced at the evidence one last time. He didn't look at Tina. He didn't need to. His decision was already made. "I'll take this matter under advisement," Judge Ortiz said, his voice final. "But it's clear there are more layers to this story than what's been presented." The gavel came down with a heavy thud, and just like that, the hearing was over. But as Caroline stood to leave, her legs a little less steady than before, she knew one thing. the battle was far from over. The late afternoon sun filtered through the blinds of Caroline's living room, casting long, soft shadows across the coffee table where the forensic financial review lay in front of her. It had taken days to gather all the necessary records: credit card statements, bank statements, receipts, every document from the past few years, painstakingly organized by Rachel's team. And now, Caroline had to sit and process it all. She flipped through the pages one by one, the numbers on the pages stark against the delicate stillness of her home. But as she examined Tina's spending patterns, something became painfully clear. Tina was not just overspending, she was living off the money Caroline had been giving her for Lily's education. "Look at this," Rachel said, her voice cutting through the silence as she sat across from Caroline, her eyes scanning the document. Tina's personal expenditures, dining out, luxury shopping, high-end vacation, it's all there. The records don't lie. Caroline's eyes flicked over the receipts Rachel pointed to, and her stomach tightened. Designer bags, expensive dinners at upscale restaurants, weekend getaways. None of these things had anything to do with Lily's welfare, nothing that contributed to her well-being, to her future. While your payments to Lily's tuition account for nearly half of her annual expenses, Tina's spending on herself accounts for much more than what she claims to need for living expenses, Rachel continued, her tone flat, but the sharpness of her words was unmistakable. Caroline pressed a hand to her forehead, fighting the overwhelming urge to let the frustration rise, but she couldn't let herself break yet. Not now. Not when she was so close. "You've got this all figured out, Rachel?" Caroline asked, her voice soft but laced with exhaustion. "I've got it," Rachel replied, offering a tight smile as she adjusted the pile of documents in front of her. "This is clear-cut. We have everything we need." Caroline nodded slowly, her mind reeling from the sheer scale of the manipulation. She had always known Tina wasn't forthcoming, but this was far worse than anything she could have imagined. "Look here," Rachel said, tapping a section of the records that showed Eric's paycheck, a figure that barely covered the mortgage and bills each month. Eric's income? It's barely enough to cover their basic living expenses, but Tina's spending? That doesn't match. Not even close. Caroline's chest tightened as Rachel flicked through more pages, the numbers weaving a pattern of deceit too obvious to ignore. Tina had been feeding off Caroline's generosity, living beyond her means, hiding behind the excuse of providing for Lily when it was all about maintaining an image. Gloria, who had been pacing the room quietly, stopped by the table and cast a sharp glance at the documents in front of Caroline. "She's not just lying, Caroline. She's living off you. You're funding her entire lifestyle. This whole thing? It's a scam. She's playing you for a fool." Caroline swallowed hard, pushing the tightness in her throat down. It hurt, more than she had anticipated. All these years of quietly supporting Lily, of silently enduring Tina's jabs, had been nothing more than a game for Tina to stay in control, to have everything she wanted while Caroline paid the price. Caroline turned her eyes to Rachel, who was calmly flipping through the pages as if she were reading a simple story. But to Caroline, this wasn't just a story. This was her life, her work, her sacrifices, all laid bare in numbers, in proof. And now, the proof was all too clear. "I'm done funding her show," Caroline whispered, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. It felt like a final admission, a surrender to the reality she had tried to avoid for so long. But this wasn't just about Tina anymore. It was about taking control of her own life and Lily's future. Gloria stepped forward, her expression resolute. "That's right, Caroline. No more feeding her lies. No more giving her the money to play the victim. You've done more than enough." Caroline closed her eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly, as if the weight of what she was saying was finally sinking in. This had gone on for far too long, and it was time to put an end to it. She wasn't going to stand by and let Tina continue to manipulate her. And to manipulate Lily. The doorbell rang, slicing through the tension in the room. Caroline looked up, startled, but Gloria was already moving toward the door. "Who's that?" Caroline asked, her voice shaky. Gloria opened the door and stood there for a moment before her eyes narrowed in surprise. "It's Lily." Caroline shot to her feet, her heart leaping in her chest. Lily's small form stood at the doorstep, her face pale, her eyes wide. She was clutching her backpack strap as though it were the only thing holding her steady. "Grandma!" Lily's voice trembled, her eyes searching for Caroline's. Caroline's heart clenched as she stepped forward, her arms open. Lily rushed into her embrace, her small body shaking with silent sobs. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Caroline whispered, brushing a strand of hair from Lily's face. "I heard Mom talking again," Lily whispered between sobs. "She said you were taking everything from her, that you were lying about the money. I don't know what to believe anymore, but I know you wouldn't lie to me." Caroline held her granddaughter tighter, feeling the weight of the truth press down on her chest, the finality of it all sinking in. "Shh," Caroline whispered, her voice steady. "You're right. I would never lie to you. I'll make sure you always know the truth." As Lily clung to her, Caroline felt a resolve growing stronger inside her. This was for Lily. This was for their future. She was no longer fighting just for the truth. She was fighting to protect everything she held dear. And no matter what it took, Caroline wasn't going to stop. The house was quiet in the way it always was late at night. Calm, still, like the world was holding its breath. The shadows stretched long across the hallway, stretching from room to room, as if the walls themselves were aware of the tension building in the air. Caroline sat in her bedroom, her legs crossed on the bed, her fingers drumming restlessly on the edge of the binder in her lap. It had been a long day. The hearing, the revelations, the weight of it all was settling in, and she hadn't allowed herself a moment to breathe. But as she reached for the glass of water on the nightstand, the house seemed to shift. A creak in the hallway, the softest of footsteps, too light to be Eric's, and much too deliberate. Caroline's eyes flicked up, her senses immediately on alert. She wasn't alone, and she didn't need to see her to know who it was. Tina. Caroline's pulse quickened as the footsteps drew closer. She could hear the faint shuffle, the subtle pull of the carpet beneath Tina's shoes. Then, the door to the bedroom slowly creaked open, just wide enough for a figure to slip inside. Caroline barely had time to move before Tina was at the foot of the bed, her eyes scanning the room like a predator. Caroline's heart thudded louder, but she forced herself to stay still, not yet making a sound. Tina was after Caroline knew that much. In one fluid motion, Tina crossed the room and made a beeline for the desk in the corner, her hand reaching for the binder on top. Caroline's throat went dry, her instincts screaming to stop her, to shout, but she held herself in check. Tina's fingers brushed against the leather cover, pulling it free from the desk. It was too easy, too obvious. But Caroline wasn't going to let it be that easy. "Stop," Caroline said, her voice low but steady, the command echoing in the stillness. Tina froze, her hand clutching the binder tighter as she turned, her face twisting into a sneer. "You won't need this," she spat, her tone dripping with venom. The words hit Caroline like a slap, the audacity of it all almost too much to take in. Caroline rose slowly, her body tensing with the weight of everything Tina had just done. There was a moment of silence between them, like the room itself was holding its breath. Then Caroline's voice broke the stillness, quiet but cutting. "Already copied, notarized, and filed," she said firmly, her eyes locking onto Tina's with a force that couldn't be ignored. Tina's face contorted with rage. Her grip tightened around the binder, and before Caroline could react, she threw it onto the floor, with a violent slap. The sound of it hitting the ground echoed in the room, sharp and final. "You think you can stop me?" Tina hissed, her breath quickening. "This doesn't change anything, Caroline. You can't win. You'll never win." Caroline's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't flinch. Tina's desperation was palpable, her hands shaking, but Caroline stayed calm, her eyes steady. She had come too far to let Tina's rage break her. "You're right, Tina," Caroline said, her voice low but unwavering. "I won't win by playing your game, but I'll win by playing mine." Tina took a step forward, her hands trembling with fury. But before she could take another step, the sound of a phone ringing sliced through the tension. Gloria's voice, sharp and quick, echoed from the other room. "I'll handle this," she said, already dialing as she moved toward the door. Tina didn't even look at her, too focused on Caroline. But Caroline didn't need to say anything more. Tina was running out of moves, and she knew it. Outside the bedroom, Gloria's conversation with someone, a police friend, Caroline guessed, was brief but decisive. She hung up quickly, her voice carrying back into the room. "I've got someone on the way." "This is over." Tina Rachel's voice joined the fray, calm and measured as always. even over the phone. Attempted evidence tampering? Note it, she said, the sharpness of her words cutting through the atmosphere. This will only make things worse for you. Tina's eyes darted back and forth, her face pale, but the anger was still there. It burned behind her eyes, simmering with the kind of fury that was impossible to ignore. Caroline knew that this was far from over. But in this moment, with the truth in her hands and the law closing in, Tina was the one who was losing ground. The doorbell rang a moment later, and Tina's shoulders sagged. She didn't speak, didn't move. Caroline could almost feel the realization hitting Tina that this wasn't a game anymore. This wasn't something she could control with her lies, with her manipulation. Tina turned toward the door, but before she could take another step, Caroline spoke again, her voice clear and unwavering. "You should leave now, Tina," Caroline said softly, but with finality. "This is over." For a brief moment, Tina seemed like she might lash out, but then her shoulders drooped. She didn't say another word. Without a glance back, she stormed out of the room, leaving Caroline alone with the weight of everything that was about to change. Caroline stood still, her heart still racing but her resolve stronger than ever. This was just the beginning. There was no going back. And this time, Tina had made the mistake of underestimating Caroline. The game was hers to win now. The school grounds buzzed with a low hum of whispered conversation, a ripple of murmurs that Caroline could feel as soon as she stepped out of the car. It wasn't the usual chatter of parents catching up. This was different. There was an edge to the voices, a tension that sliced through the air like a knife. As Caroline walked towards the pickup area, she could hear the fragments of conversations that drifted her way, each word another piece of the rumor mill grinding into motion. "Did you hear about Tina's guardianship petition? She says Caroline's been taking money from her, pretending to be the one who's been paying for Lily's school." Caroline's stomach tightened, but she refused to let the hurt show. She lifted her chin, squared her shoulders, and continued forward, her steps measured, her composure unshaken. She had walked through storms before. This one would be no different. The whispers didn't stop as she passed the parents, but she didn't look their way. She wasn't going to feed into it. Her eyes stayed forward, on the little girl she loved more than anything in the world. Lily stood a little off to the side, her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the ground as if she were trying to disappear into the shadows. Caroline's heart clenched at the sight of her granddaughter, so small and vulnerable in this world of adult battles. "Grandma!" Lily's voice cracked as she looked up, her face flushed with the remnants of a struggle she didn't deserve to carry. I heard what Mom said. About the money. She said you're taking everything from her." Caroline's breath hitched, but she didn't let her face betray the turmoil swirling inside her. She reached out, cupping Lily's face in her hands, forcing the girl to meet her eyes. "You don't have to worry about that, sweetheart," Caroline said softly, her voice steady and soothing. "We walk through storms steady. We don't let them change who we are." Lily blinked, the uncertainty in her eyes clear. But there was something else too. Something stronger. A flicker of the quiet strength Caroline had always known was there. "Mom's just mad, isn't she?" Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. Caroline's chest tightened at the question. She could see it now, the weight of Tina's lies starting to settle in her granddaughter's heart. Tina had already poisoned the air around them, and it wasn't just Caroline who was feeling the burn of it. Lily was being caught in the crossfire. "Yes, darling," Caroline said gently, "but this has nothing to do with you. This is between adults. You just focus on being you. You're not alone." Lily gave a small nod, but her eyes were still filled with questions Caroline didn't want to answer yet. She didn't want to burden her granddaughter with this war, not when there was still so much innocence left in her. But the truth, no matter how painful, was something they would face together. And no matter how much Tina twisted the story, Caroline was determined that Lily would always know where the truth lay. The air around them shifted, though, as Principal Rowe made her way toward them, her expression guarded but sympathetic. She approached with the kind of quiet confidence Caroline had come to expect from her, her eyes scanning the small group of parents who stood nearby, whispering under their breaths. "Caroline," Rowe began, her voice low but firm, "I need to address the rumors that are circulating. Tina's claims are exaggerated, to say the least." Caroline gave a small nod, grateful that Principal Rowe wasn't allowing the false narrative to spread unchecked. Rowe had always been a steady ally, someone who saw the truth, even when it wasn't convenient. I've already called a few of the parents privately, Roe continued, her gaze flicking over to the group of whispering parents. We'll get this cleared up. Thank you, Caroline said, her voice quiet but sincere. She could feel the tension in her chest begin to loosen, but she knew this was just the beginning. There would be more to fight, more people to convince, and Tina wasn't going to go down without trying to pull everyone around her down too. Rose's expression softened, her eyes lingering on Caroline for just a moment longer before she gave a quick nod and turned back to address the other parents, her voice sharp and authoritative. We will not stand for rumors and false accusations here. Please, if you have questions, come to me directly. I'll be happy to provide clarity. Caroline watched as the murmur of the crowd shifted, the whispers dying down, some of the parents looking embarrassed, others sheepishly avoiding eye contact. Rose's presence was like a wall, holding the lie at bay, making sure it couldn't spread any further. But Caroline knew the damage had already been done. The seed had been planted, and it would take more than one conversation to uproot it. As Roe moved on, Martin Hale, the school's bursar, approached them with his usual stoic expression. He carried a folder in his hand, the weight of it unmistakable. I've prepared an affidavit for you, Caroline, he said, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of concern. It'll make things clearer. We'll need to get it to the courts, and quickly. Caroline took the affidavit from him, her fingers brushing against the thick paper. She nodded, though the weight of it felt heavier than anything she'd carried before. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about standing her ground, about making sure that Lily's future would not be tainted by lies. But even as the paperwork began to fill in the gaps, the deeper truth weighed on Caroline's heart. The rumors were far from over. And as the bell rang for the school day to end, Caroline knew there would be more battles to face. Lily squeezed her hand tighter as they walked to the car. The air around them seemed a little quieter, a little less hostile. But Caroline knew this calm was only temporary. The storm would rise again, and she would be ready. The courtroom felt colder today, the air thicker with expectation. The sharp clack of Caroline's heels on the polished floor seemed louder than ever as she entered, each step resonating with the weight of what was to come. She had known this moment was coming for weeks, but now that it was here, she couldn't shake the feeling that the stakes were higher than ever. Tina sat at the other side of the courtroom, her posture stiff, her face taut with frustration. She had nothing left but empty words. She had tried to craft a story that fit her narrative, one where she was the victim, and Caroline was a mere footnote, a babysitter to Lily. But the evidence was in Caroline's hands now. The truth had been laid out in black and white. Tina had nothing left to support her claims. Rachel Denton sat next to Caroline, her presence a solid, comforting foundation amidst the quiet chaos. The courtroom was packed, the atmosphere tense. Caroline kept her gaze straight ahead, but her fingers rested gently on the binder she had placed on the table. It felt heavy, but she didn't fear what was inside. She welcomed it. She had done nothing wrong, and she had the proof to back it up. Tina's lawyer stood up first, his voice smooth and practiced, though it carried the hollow sound of desperation. Your Honor, the claims presented here are simple. Caroline Myers has inserted herself into Lily's life under false pretenses, using her financial contributions as a means to manipulate her daughter-in-law. She claims to be a savior, but in truth, she has taken everything from Tina. We ask that the petition for guardianship be granted immediately. The words hung in the air, but Caroline remained unmoved. She didn't need to respond. The truth would speak louder than any lies. Rachel stood next, her movements confident, her voice clear. Your Honor, I ask you to look at the facts. We have here the notarized receipts, the bank transfers, and the tuition record, all of which clearly show that Caroline Myers has been the sole financial provider for Lily's education. These records paint a different picture than the one Tina has presented. Rachel handed the binder to the court clerk, who passed it to the judge. Caroline watched as Judge Ortiz flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing slightly with each turn. The silence in the room was palpable. I'll be honest with you, Ms. Myers, the judge said, his eyes lifting from the papers to look directly at Tina. These records speak for themselves. I don't see any evidence that Caroline has been anything other than a grandmother trying to ensure her granddaughter's future. Tina's face paled, but she didn't look away. She opened her mouth to speak, but the judge cut her off with a wave of his hand. Miss Myers, he said, his voice carrying an authority that filled the room. I'm not interested in hearing any more about how Caroline has taken money from you. The evidence in front of me is clear. You have presented no proof to support your claims, nothing substantial. Your accusations are baseless. Tina's face twisted in disbelief. Her lips parted as if to argue, but the words stuck in her throat. The courtroom was silent, waiting for her to respond, but there was nothing more she could say. The truth had been laid bare, and it was too much for her to deny. Eric, sitting quietly in the back, looked down at his hands. His face was pale, his eyes avoiding Caroline. Caroline glanced at him, and in that brief moment, their eyes met. There was a flicker of guilt there, but no apology. He had been silent throughout the entire process, unwilling to take a stand, unwilling to face what had been right in front of him for so long. A soft sigh escaped Caroline's lips, but she didn't let herself dwell on it. She had her eyes on Lily now. Lily, who had been sitting with Gloria near the back of the room, was called to the stand. Caroline's heart ached as she watched her granddaughter make her way forward. The child looked smaller than usual, her hands clasped together, her gaze a little too steady for someone so young, but there was strength in Lily's eyes. Caroline saw it now, the quiet determination that had been growing in her over the past weeks. The judge nodded at Lily, a kind smile softening his features. Would you like to share something with the court, young lady? Lily looked at Caroline for a moment, a silent question in her eyes. Caroline gave a small nod, a quiet reassurance that this was the right thing to do. With a small breath, Lily turned toward the judge, her voice steady but quiet. Grandma always pays. She always takes care of me. Mom says things that aren't true, but Grandma never lies. She's always been there for me. The room was still as Lily spoke. It wasn't the most eloquent testimony, but it was raw and honest, and it cut through the courtroom like a knife. Caroline felt the weight of the words settle in her chest, the quiet truth of them echoing through her. This was why she had done everything she had done, for Lily, for the truth. There was a collective sigh in the room, a shift that was palpable. The tide had turned. The murmurs that had once filled the air now softened, and the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Judge Ortiz looked at Tina, then at Caroline. His expression hardened as he spoke. Miss Myers, he said, his voice firm, your petition for guardianship edges dangerously close to exploitation. I am not inclined to grant it. Tina's face flushed with frustration, but Caroline remained still, her expression calm. This was it. This was the turning point. The storm had finally passed. Court is adjourned, Judge Ortiz said, the gavel striking sharply. I'll review the evidence further and issue a final ruling shortly. The room emptied quickly, but Caroline stood tall, her back straight, her heart finally beginning to find its steadiness. The battle wasn't over yet, but this was a victory for truth, for Lily, and for everything she had fought for. As they left the courtroom, Rachel touched Caroline's arm lightly. You did well today, she said quietly. We're almost there. Caroline nodded, her eyes scanning the hallway ahead. There was still much to do, but for the first time in a long while, Caroline allowed herself to believe that, maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. The courtroom was quieter today. The energy that had once been a whirlwind now dissipated into a dull hum of anticipation. Caroline sat at the front, her fingers lightly touching the edge of the table, her mind still clouded from the weeks of legal battles. The victory was in reach, but she knew Tina wouldn't relent easily. Not yet. Tina's lawyer, who had been silent and seemingly defeated after the last hearing, was speaking now, his voice carrying an edge of desperation. Your Honor, we request immediate access to Caroline Myers' home. We believe there are assets, financial records, and further evidence that could support my client's claims. We have reason to believe that Caroline's financial holdings are hidden in her residence. Caroline's breath caught for a moment, but she kept her posture steady, her hands folded neatly on her lap. Tina wasn't just after Lily's future. Now she was coming for everything. The house, the property that had been Caroline's sanctuary for years, was under threat. Tina had already pushed so far, but now, this was something new. Rachel Denton, ever calm, stood next to Caroline, the quiet strength of her presence a reminder that Caroline wasn't alone. Your Honor, Rachel said, her voice measured but unwavering. There is no legal basis for this motion. The property in question is secured through a living trust, and Caroline's assets are well beyond the reach of any personal claims Tina may make. Furthermore, this is a direct attempt to intimidate and coerce the judge. Samuel Ortiz adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the motion with a quick, almost dismissive glance. Caroline could see it in his face. He wasn't buying it. The man who had already dismissed Tina's first petition wasn't going to be swayed by a last-ditch attempt to undermine Caroline further. "I've reviewed the details of this case," Judge Ortiz said, his voice carrying a note of finality. "And based on the legal framework before me, this motion is without merit. Miss Myers's home and its contents are protected under her living trust. No further action will be taken." Tina's lawyer opened his mouth to object, but the judge cut him off sharply. Motion dismissed. Caroline allowed herself a small sigh of relief. Tina had just failed again. But it was the way Tina's face flushed, turning beet red with rage, that made Caroline feel a strange sense of peace. This was it. Tina's attempts to tear apart her life, her family, were falling apart before her eyes. Tina's hands clenched into fists as she shot a glance toward Caroline, her eyes flashing with venom. Her mouth moved, but no words came out. She was too furious to speak, her face contorted with frustration, but there was nothing left to fight with. Gloria, who had been sitting quietly beside Caroline, leaned over and whispered in her ear, "She keeps hitting walls you built." Her tone was grim but satisfied, as if the finality of it was slowly settling in. "That's all she's got left. Empty threats." Caroline didn't answer immediately. She was watching Tina, her enemy's face twisted with rage, and for the first time in the entire battle, Caroline could feel the weight lift slightly from her shoulders. Tina wasn't going to win. Not anymore. Lily, sitting quietly beside Gloria, had been unusually still throughout the hearing, but as the gavel struck, signaling the end of the motion, Caroline glanced down at her granddaughter. Lily's eyes were wide with concern, the hurt of the past few weeks still visible on her face. Lily looked up at Caroline, her small hand reaching out to gently squeeze her grandmother's. "Grandma, is everything okay?" she asked, her voice soft, but filled with the uncertainty of a child who had been caught in the middle of far too much. Caroline smiled down at her, her heart swelling with a fierce protectiveness. She reached over, gently brushing a lock of hair behind Lily's ear. "Everything's going to be just fine, sweetheart," she said quietly, her voice calm but filled with conviction. "We've made it through the worst of it." Lily nodded, but her eyes didn't lose their anxiousness. Caroline knew her granddaughter wasn't as sure of that as she seemed. Lily had borne the weight of Tina's cruelty, and the ripple effects of the lies were still raw. But Caroline wasn't about to let anything break the bond they shared. Not anymore. The courtroom began to empty, the murmur of voices filling the air once again. Caroline stood slowly, taking Lily's hand and leading her toward the door. The weight of the hearing had already started to slip from her shoulders, replaced by the quiet but undeniable relief of knowing that Tina had lost. She had been stopped. But even as Caroline walked through the door with Lily at her side, her heart tightened with the realization that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Tina would find new ways to fight, new tactics to employ. But Caroline knew one thing for sure: she would never back down. As they stepped out of the courthouse, Caroline glanced down at Lily. "No more storms, darling," she whispered. "We're safe now." But even as the words left her lips, Caroline couldn't shake the feeling that the real storm was still yet to come. The late afternoon sun streamed through the office windows, casting long shadows on the cluttered desk of District Attorney Rachel Devereaux. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, the soft clicks filling the otherwise quiet room. Caroline stood in the doorway, her back straight and her mind racing, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her. She had expected this moment, but now that it was here, it felt surreal. Tina had pushed too far, and now the DA's office had the evidence they needed to investigate her. Investigate her for attempted guardianship fraud. It wasn't just about lies anymore. This was something much darker. Rachel looked up from her computer, her eyes meeting Caroline's with a steady, unshakable gaze. "The DA's office has reviewed all of Tina's financial records," she said, her voice even. It's clear that she's been falsifying documents and misrepresenting her financial situation to gain guardianship of Lily. She's also been using her position to pressure Eric into signing off on things he didn't understand. Caroline's stomach churned, but she didn't let it show. She had suspected it, knew it deep down, but hearing it confirmed hit harder than she had expected. So what happens now? Rachel pushed a folder across the desk, the thick papers inside a stark reminder of the web of lies Tina had spun. Tina's under investigation for fraud. The next steps involve gathering more evidence and pushing forward with charges. Meanwhile, I'm filing a civil countersuit for defamation and emotional distress. This has gone too far. Caroline's fingers gripped the edge of the desk, her nails digging into the wood. There was a part of her that was relieved, that felt a glimmer of justice. But the other part, the one that had always believed in family, ached with the knowledge that this was not how things were supposed to be. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. This was a battle for the heart of her family, and she knew she couldn't stop now. "Eric?" Caroline asked quietly, her voice catching slightly. Rachel hesitated for a moment, as though weighing her words carefully. "Eric finally admitted to me that Tina pressured him. He's been avoiding confronting the truth for too long, but he knows now. He was afraid of what Tina might do, afraid of losing her. But now that he sees the full extent of her actions, he's finally ready to take a stand." Caroline's chest tightened. It was the admission she had waited for, but it didn't feel like the victory she had imagined. Eric had been complicit in all of this, even if it was out of fear, out of love for a woman who had played him. The man she had once trusted, the father of her son, had stood by as Tina manipulated their lives, their daughter's future. It hurt more than she could say. Lily, her sweet, quiet granddaughter. Caroline's gaze softened as the thought of her crossed her mind. She had borne the brunt of this struggle. She had witnessed it all, the manipulation, the lies, the legal battles. And yet, despite everything, Lily had remained loyal, had trusted her. Caroline glanced at Rachel, who was flipping through more papers. "How is Lily?" Rachel didn't look up, but her voice was gentle. "She's struggling. The truth is weighing heavily on her, but she's strong. She'll get through this. She's just confused, torn between her mom and her grandmother. But the fact that she's stayed loyal to you speaks volumes." Caroline nodded, though the knot in her stomach refused to loosen. It wasn't just the lies that had torn through their family, it was the ripple effect. The way it had infected Lily's world had made her question things that no child should ever have to question. Caroline had done everything to protect Lily from the chaos, but now it felt like it was unavoidable. Gloria entered the office, her face grim but determined. "The tide's here," she said without preamble, her eyes flashing with a fierce energy that had always kept Caroline grounded. "Tina's going down, and the truth is out. It's only a matter of time before the whole world knows what she's been doing." Caroline's heart swelled with gratitude. Gloria had been by her side from the beginning, a steadfast friend who had never wavered, no matter how fierce the storm. But even Gloria knew the fight wasn't over yet. It was just beginning. Caroline took a deep breath and nodded. "Let it rise." The words were soft, but full of purpose. Caroline knew the storm wasn't over. Tina wouldn't give up easily, but this time, Caroline was ready. She had the truth on her side, and this was one battle she wouldn't lose. She stood up, her resolve hardening like steel. As they walked out of the office together, Gloria and Rachel flanking her, Caroline felt the weight of everything settle in her chest. She wasn't just fighting for Lily anymore. She was fighting for herself, for the life she had built, for the family she had always believed in. And as the door to the DA's office closed behind her, Caroline felt a spark of something fierce and unyielding. The tide was rising, and it was time to face it head-on. The courtroom was tense, the weight of the day's proceedings hanging thick in the air like smoke. The jurors sat still, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and scrutiny, as the trial finally began in earnest. Caroline could feel their eyes on her, but she kept her gaze straight ahead, her back straight, her posture calm. She had been through the worst of this battle. She had survived the whispers, the lies, the accusations, and now it was time for the truth to stand on its own. Tina, on the other hand, looked as though she were barely holding it together. Her posture was rigid, her eyes flickering nervously. Around the room, as the prosecutor, Martin Hale, stood to present his case. The very air seemed to shrink when he spoke, his voice booming with authority as he laid the groundwork for the evidence. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Martin began, his eyes briefly flicking to Caroline before locking onto Tina. "We will present proof today that the defendant, Tina Myers, has attempted to manipulate both the financial system and her family in a bid for guardianship of Lily Myers. The truth is, in the records we've gathered, and we'll show that Tina has misrepresented her financial situation, falsified documents, and put her own desires ahead of her daughter's well-being." Martin placed a thick stack of documents onto the table, each page heavy with the weight of years of deceit. Caroline's fingers tightened around the edge of the bench, but she kept her composure as Martin turned to the judge and the jury, presenting notarized documents, financial records, and proof of the massive amounts of money Tina had hidden in her own account while claiming to struggle financially. The jury shifted uncomfortably as Martin handed over the final document, Tina's financial timeline, a detailed account of every dollar that had been spent, each transaction laid bare, a testament to the vast discrepancies between what Tina claimed and what was true. Rachel Denton stood up, poised and deliberate as she took the floor. She spoke with the precision of someone who had spent months preparing for this moment. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Rachel said, her voice calm but carrying a quiet fire. "We will show that Tina Myers used her own manipulation of financial records to control the narrative, to create a false image of hardship when, in reality, she was living lavishly on funds that were meant for Lily. The truth is, here in these records, Caroline Myers, the true financial provider for her granddaughter, paid every tuition bill, every expense, every cent." Rachel turned, and the room seemed to lean in, every eye fixed on her as she methodically walked through the timeline of financial transactions, each one a revelation, each one a crack in Tina's carefully constructed facade. Tina's eyes darted nervously between the judge and the jury. She shifted in her seat, unable to sit still as Rachel methodically dismantled her lies, but it was clear to everyone in the room, Tina was losing control. Then, Tina did something unexpected. As Rachel finished her presentation, Tina leapt to her feet, her voice rising in anger, her face flushed with fury. "This is all a lie! None of this is true!" she shouted, her eyes wild with frustration. "You don't know anything about what I've been through. I've done everything for that girl. And you?" She pointed at Caroline with trembling hands. "You've taken everything from me. You've stolen my family, my life, my future." The courtroom gasped at her outburst. The judge, his face hardening, banged the gavel loudly. "Miss Myers," he warned, his voice stern, "sit down and control yourself. You will not disrupt these proceedings. This is your final warning, Tina." Her chest heaving, seethed in silence, her face red with rage. But she didn't speak again, and her outburst hung in the air like a storm cloud. Caroline remained still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression unreadable. She had seen this before, the desperation, the rage, the refusal to accept the truth. But she wouldn't react. Not now. Not when she had come so far. Rachel turned back to the jury, her voice calm and confident. "The facts are clear, Your Honor. The evidence is undeniable. Tina's attempts to manipulate the guardianship process were built on falsehoods and deceit. She has no right to control Lily's life." The judge nodded, his expression stern as he glanced at the jury. "I suggest we take a brief recess before deliberations begin," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. As the jury filed out of the room, Caroline stood slowly, the weight of the trial pressing down on her. She glanced at Lily, who was sitting quietly in the back, her face pale but composed. Lily hadn't said a word throughout the trial. She hadn't spoken of the pain she must have felt, the confusion in her heart. But Caroline knew that Lily was feeling everything, every word, every look, every revelation. Gloria approached Caroline, her expression resolute. "She's cracking, Caroline," Gloria whispered. "Tina can't keep this up much longer." Caroline nodded, her lips pressed tightly together. "I know, but this has to be enough." The courtroom doors swung open as the jury filed back in. The atmosphere felt thick, like the air just before a storm. Caroline sat down again, her heart racing, her breath slow but steady. The moment of truth was almost here. The final chapter was about to be written, and as the jury took their seats, Caroline knew that whatever happened next, she had done everything she could to protect the only thing that mattered, Lily. The courtroom was heavy with silence, the tension palpable in the air as the jury returned. Caroline's heart was pounding, each beat a drum in her chest, but she remained still, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The long weeks of waiting, the endless battles, today they would come to an end. Today, the truth would be set free. The jury filed into their seats, their faces unreadable, and the judge, Samuel Ortiz, motioned for the room to quiet. The gavel struck, and the sound seemed to reverberate in Caroline's bones. She leaned slightly forward, every fiber of her being focused on what was coming next. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Judge Ortiz began, his voice steady and commanding. "Have you reached a verdict?" The foreman stood, his gaze briefly flicking over to Tina, then settling on the judge. "We have, Your Honor." The room held its breath as the foreman turned to face the court. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Tina Myers, guilty of attempted guardianship fraud." The words hit like a thunderclap, sending a ripple of shock through the room. Caroline's chest tightened, but her lips trembled into a faint, quiet smile. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. The lies were no longer just whispers. They had been exposed for what they were. Tina's face went pale, her mouth opening and closing as if trying to speak, but failing to form words. Her shoulders sagged, the weight of the conviction hitting her all at once. Caroline felt a strange sense of calm wash over her, the bitterness of the past months finally finding its release in the form of justice. Judge Ortiz adjusted his glasses, his expression unyielding. "Miss Myers," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "I hereby strip you of all financial rights regarding Lily Myers. You are no longer authorized to make any decisions concerning her well-being or her future." The words hung in the air, and Caroline could see Tina's whole world crumble in front of her. The courtroom was still, the air thick with the sound of her breathing as she seemed to shrink in her seat. The grip she had once tried to maintain on Lily's life, on their future, was slipping away, unraveling piece by piece. But Judge Ortiz wasn't done. His next words rang out like a final hammer striking steel. "Furthermore, Ms. Myers, you are ordered to pay restitution to Caroline Myers for the financial damages incurred by your actions. The court will determine the exact amount." Tina's face flushed a deep red with rage and humiliation, but there was nothing she could do. The verdict was final. The room felt as though it had exhaled collectively, the tension dissipating like smoke on the wind. Caroline could feel a release deep inside her, but she kept her composure. This wasn't about celebrating. It was about knowing she had done everything she could to protect Lily. Eric sat in the back, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the ground. Caroline saw him slump slightly in his chair, the weight of his inaction finally breaking through. The guilt was written all over him. He had been complicit in Tina's lies, afraid to stand up, afraid to face the truth. But now, it was all laid bare. There was no hiding from it. Caroline's heart tightened as she turned to glance at Lily. She had been so brave, so quiet through all of this. The little girl had watched, witnessed everything, carried the weight of it all without fully understanding the depths of it. She had been caught in the middle of a war she never asked for, a war that threatened to tear apart everything she held dear. Lily was sitting with Gloria, her head resting on her grandmother's shoulder. Her small body trembled, the emotions of the day finally catching up with her. She didn't need to speak. Caroline could see it in her eyes, the mix of relief and sorrow, the realization that it was finally over, but at what cost? As the courtroom began to clear, Caroline stood, her knees slightly unsteady. But when she looked down at Lily, her granddaughter looked up at her with a mixture of quiet fear and hope. Lily's small hand reached for Caroline's, and the moment their fingers touched, the weight of everything fell away. Lily threw her arms around Caroline, holding on as if she were afraid to let go. "I knew you'd win, Grandma," she whispered, her voice muffled against Caroline's shoulder. "I knew you'd make it right." Caroline squeezed her tight, her chest aching with the emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel until now. "I promised you, didn't I?" she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "I promised I'd always be here for you." Gloria, standing beside them, gave a small but satisfied smile, her arms crossed as she watched the tender moment unfold. Babysitter, huh? She murmured, her voice laced with amusement. Looks like you're more than that, Caroline. Caroline looked up, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Grandmother, she said, her voice steady. Just grandmother. As the last of the courtroom doors closed and the hum of conversation from the hall faded into the distance, Caroline stood there, holding Lily close. The storm was over. The fight had been long, but the truth had won. And Caroline knew, deep in her heart, that she had done the one thing that mattered most. She had protected Lily. For the first time in a long while, Caroline allowed herself to breathe, to let the weight of it all sink in. It was over. The battle was done. But the victory? That would be felt for the rest of their lives. Caroline's house was still. The rush of the courtroom, the relentless beat of the trial had fallen away, leaving only the hum of her own thoughts. The front door clicked shut behind her as she entered, and the familiar scent of home, of old wood, and the quiet comfort of years lived here. Wrapped around her like a soft blanket, her heels echoed as she moved across the hallway, her hands resting on the cold metal of the binder that she had held onto through every twist and turn. She placed it carefully into the small steel safe in the corner of her bedroom, locking it with a deliberate click. The record, every tuition receipt, every document, every piece of proof, were tucked away now, where they could no longer be used as a weapon against her or Lily. The fight was over. The truth was sealed. But there was no peace in her movements. Not yet. The house was quiet, but Caroline didn't mind the silence. It felt like the calm after a storm, like the world was finally taking a breath. She needed this. For a moment, the years of struggle, of second-guessing and anxiety, felt distant. She had won. She had protected Lily. It was all over. Lily came into the room, holding a crayon in one hand and a piece of paper in the other. She was quiet, as usual, but her eyes sparkled with something Caroline hadn't seen in a long time: hope. She held up the drawing, a simple picture, but one that was more profound than any words could express. It was a picture of the two of them, Caroline and Lily, sitting together. There were no words, no backgrounds, just the image of them holding hands, side by side. Caroline's heart clenched. She crouched down in front of Lily, her voice soft as she took the drawing in her hands. "This is beautiful, sweetheart," she whispered, her thumb gently stroking the edge of the paper. Lily nodded, a shy smile crossing her face. "I wanted to make it so you'd always remember." "Always remember what, darling?" "That you're my grandma and no one can change that." Caroline's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "And nothing ever will, sweetheart. Nothing ever will." They stayed like that for a moment, quiet, safe, as if the world outside didn't exist, as if the weight of the past few months had finally fallen away. A knock at the door broke the silence. Caroline stood up and walked toward the sound. She opened the door to find Gloria standing there, holding a bottle of champagne in one hand, a wide grin on her face. The look of quiet triumph in her eyes mirrored Caroline's own feelings. "Thought we could celebrate," Gloria said, raising the bottle. "I'd say this calls for something a little stronger than tea." Caroline chuckled softly, stepping aside to let Gloria in. "I don't think I've ever been more ready for a drink in my life," she replied, a hint of laughter escaping her lips. Gloria moved to the kitchen and began pulling out glasses as Caroline leaned against the doorframe, watching her granddaughter quietly sketch in the living room. A small weight in her chest lifted as she watched Lily, her fingers flying across the paper again, lost in the world of her drawings. For once, there was a peace about her too. Before long, Rachel arrived, the final paperwork in hand. She was all business, as always, but there was something different today, something softer. The lines around her eyes seemed to relax as she placed the documents on the table. "Everything's finalized," Rachel said, her voice quieter than usual. "It's all officially over. Tina's done. And you're free, Caroline, free to focus on what matters most." Caroline nodded slowly, the finality of the words settling into her bones. "I can't tell you how much that means," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This wasn't just about winning. It was about Lily, about protecting her." Rachel smiled, a rare softness in her expression. "You did that, Caroline. You fought for what mattered. And now, Lily has a future." The room grew still for a moment, the quiet weight of their shared victory hanging in the air. Caroline felt it. Finally, the last of the tension lifting, like a storm passing. The battle had been long, But it was over. And now, there was peace. Gloria handed Caroline a glass of champagne. To the real victory, she said, her eyes twinkling. To family. Caroline smiled and raised her glass. To family, she echoed, the words feeling like a promise. They clinked glasses, the sound bright and clear, like a bell ringing in the distance. But it wasn't just the taste of champagne that lingered on Caroline's tongue. It was the warmth of her home, of her granddaughter, of the life they had fought to keep together. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the room, Caroline sat back, letting herself relax for the first time in months. The house was quiet now, safe. The world outside had no place here, not anymore. The storm had passed, and for the first time, Caroline allowed herself to feel the peace that followed. The conference hall was filled with an air of quiet anticipation, the hum of whispered conversations weaving through the room as Caroline stood backstage, adjusting the hem of her dress. It was a simple black dress, one she'd worn before, but today it felt different. It felt like the weight of all that had transpired, the months of tension, the battle to protect Lily, the courtroom battles, the pain and the triumph was condensed into this moment. Today, she wasn't just a grandmother who had survived. She was a woman who had fought, who had claimed victory, and who was now ready to share her story with others who understood the gravity of what it meant to stand for something greater than oneself. Caroline's hands were steady as she smoothed her palms over the front of the dress, the memory of all that had led up to this moment flashing through her mind. Lily, Gloria, Rachel, each of them had been her strength. And now, as she stepped onto the stage, it was her turn to offer strength to others. The audience was a sea of faces, all of them attentive, all of them waiting for her words. The bright lights from the stage softened, the edges of the room casting everything in a soft golden glow. Caroline's breath came evenly as she approached the podium, feeling the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. She reached for the microphone and took a slow, deep breath before speaking. "Thank you for having me today," she began, her voice strong, unwavering. "I'm here to tell you about a story of a woman who was underestimated, a woman who was told she didn't belong, that she didn't have the right to make decisions for her granddaughter. And in that fight, I found out something about myself, about the strength we all carry inside of us, whether we know it or not." The audience leaned in as Caroline's words filled the air, the quiet, measured cadence of her voice keeping everyone's. She continued, telling her story, of how she had been dismissed as just the babysitter by her daughter-in-law, of how the legal battle had threatened to tear apart her family, of how she had fought, not for herself, but for Lily's future. She told them of the tuition checks, the courtroom drama, the moments of doubt, and the quiet defiance that had carried her through it all. "When you fight for something that matters," Caroline said, her voice gaining strength, "you learn that it's not just about proving a point, it's about protecting what you love. I didn't fight for recognition. I fought because Lily deserved a future that wasn't dictated by lies. I fought because the truth was worth protecting." As she spoke, Caroline could feel the energy of the room shifting. The silence was thick with understanding, and she could see the faces of the audience reflecting what she knew to be true. There were many of them who had fought similar battles, who had sacrificed and struggled, who understood the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity. "And through it all," she continued, her voice softening but still firm, "I never lost sight of one thing. I wasn't just a babysitter. I was her grandmother, and that made me strong. That made me a force that no lie, no person, no system could take away." The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of her words settling into the hearts of everyone present. Then, as if on cue, the first applause broke out. Soft at first, but then building in intensity as the audience began to stand, their claps filling the hall with a thunderous warmth. Caroline smiled, but it wasn't the smile of someone who sought praise. It was the smile of someone who had found peace in her purpose. As the applause finally tapered off, Gloria, who had been seated near the front, caught Caroline's eye. She grinned and mouthed, "From insult to impact." Caroline chuckled softly to herself, the corners of her lips curling upward. Gloria always knew how to turn a moment around, and today, it was exactly what Caroline needed. Lily, who had been sitting at the back, her small face turned toward the stage, beamed with pride. Caroline's heart swelled as she met her granddaughter's eyes. Lily's gaze was unwavering, her small hands clasped together in silent admiration. For the first time in a long while, Caroline could see the strength Lily had carried through all the turmoil, and she knew, deep down, that everything she had done, every sacrifice, every moment of doubt, it had all been worth it. Caroline looked back at the audience, her hands resting calmly on the podium, her voice steady as she spoke the final words. I don't babysit dignity, I guard it. And that's a role I will carry with pride for as long as I live. The room erupted in applause once more, louder this time, as if the words had broken through something deeper than just the surface of the story. Caroline felt a deep sense of fulfillment, of peace, wash over her. This was it, the end of one chapter, and the beginning of another. As she left the stage, Gloria, Rachel, and Lily were waiting for her. Caroline stepped into the embrace of her granddaughter, who squeezed her tight. I'm so proud of you, Grandma, Lily whispered. Caroline held her close, feeling the weight of everything finally lift. The fight had been long, but the victory was theirs. And when the principal checked the records, she knew exactly who paid the tuition.